with you today, and I hope we can build on now on what the CMOs were just talking about and put it in some context of how the world feels these days, how the world is reacting to the challenges around us, seen particularly from the lens of people living their lives these days. So I'm going to share with you a report that's been done by Ipsos this year. It's got a slightly depressing title, A New World Disorder, because I think the findings do make us think a little bit about where we are and where we're heading. And it's got quite a precise subtitle. We talk about navigating, deliberately so, because we know that we are going or trying to go in a certain direction, but we may need to make adjustments to get there. And we're also talking about the word polycrisis, a new word, certainly in the English language this year, that we found quite useful as a way of referencing perhaps some of the uncertainties that we have, this sense that the crises are an event that's happening in plurality. There are a number of crises going on, and that they add up potentially to something that's greater than the sum of their parts, and make it particularly difficult for us to be certain about whether we're making the right decisions right here, right now. Going into this year, of course, we're all very clear about the uncertain moments that the year had. The end of 2022, of course, we were just starting to come out of the COVID crisis, but a real sense of uncertainty around the world. So I'm going to be sharing with you a number of pieces of research from Ipsos, focusing particularly on a study called Global Trends. But this is what people were telling us when we asked them to predict what would happen this year. And certainly what we were finding in Turkey was a very strong sense that prices will increase faster than revenues. 80% were saying that. We found that 66% expected a natural disaster to happen in Turkey, and you were much higher than the world average there. And of course, with the events, the tragic events of February, that is what you have experienced. And that was certainly part of what we saw looking at your results coming into this year. And we also saw a certain degree of optimism that it might be a better year than before, but it wasn't particularly pervasive, let's say. So we went into the year with uncertain moments, but we also tried to go into the year with, let's say, a guidebook and some research to help us think about where we're going. And this is the study I'm going to be sharing with you now. We've been doing it for nearly 10 years. The first time we did it was in 2014. And at that time, we found that 60% of people were constantly looking at screens these days. I deliberately share the results from 10 years ago because it's a reminder that we've now been in a digital world for a very long time. Much of this is the absolute normal for all of us. We found that 78% in China, at that point, we're looking at screens these days. And in Turkey, our figure was 63%. So certainly this sense of, let's say, having access immediately to all sorts of information around us, a reminder that this is not new. What we tried to do in this latest report is get a feeling from around the world of how people are reacting to this polycrisis. We've got 50 countries, including Turkey, of course, covering 70% of the world's population and even more of the local economy. And what we've been trying to do is to ground a survey against some broader thinking about how change works and about how we can think about the big macro forces that are affecting us all around the world. I'll talk about those in a moment. How we can identify some of the shifts that are taking place right here, right now, and how we can also be clear about the signals of change that might tell us something about what the future will look like, or give us ideas about whether our products or services might need to adapt, or indeed might have a great opportunity during the period ahead. So we've tried to ground our survey in this context of what's happening out there in the world. We've identified 6 macro forces that are our reference point to help us think through the challenges that we're facing, perhaps from our own particular organization that we're working in, or indeed a particular brand that we're responsible for. And I'm going to share 3 of those with you in the presentation today. The full report is available to all of you. We would really welcome you exploring it and letting us know what you think and what you find most useful. But I'm going to focus on 3, and I'm going to start with this sense of societies being in flux, and in particular the question around aging populations, which is starting to rise very significantly up the agenda in many countries around the world. We've been doing quite a bit of work on this topic because the topic about generations and generation change is one that interests people all around the world. I'm sharing you some newspaper headlines from my own country, the United Kingdom, where you will notice there are many headlines about Generation X. They are the workers who want it all. They are work shy. They are the silent majority, apparently. Much of this research doesn't necessarily stand up to a quick look at the evidence. And one of the big things that we feel we all need to do when we're thinking about populations, thinking about population change, is be very, very clear about what the data is telling us. Just 24% of the global population are in Generation Z. I would suggest that rather more than 24% in some publications and websites is around Generation Z, but there are other segments of the population we need to be closer to and think about, particularly the older generations as they mature, but also even within something like Generation Z, we're often finding important nuances, in particular differences by gender, for example, or by education levels. The headline when we're thinking about population change this year is around the population reaching 8 billion people. And sometimes articles get into questions around the world being overcrowded, about what that's going to mean in terms of population pressures. All of those, of course, important questions, but all of those have to be set against the broader context. And the broader context is of aging populations. Different countries, of course, have their own different perspectives and different situations. The China population pyramid is particularly extreme, and we haven't got time to go into the nuances of all that, but we're familiar with things like the one child policy, which has had a particular impact there on how their population pyramid has evolved. India has now famously overtaken China as the most populous country in the world. Its population is a little bit of a triangle, but notice there are already fewer at the bottom than there are in the generation or in the age group in it coming into their 20s. So already India's population growth is slowing, its fertility rate is down to 2, and we're going to see big changes to the shape of that chart in the coming period. Italy, particularly extreme. We've been doing presentations with our Italian colleagues about whether Italy is doomed by demography. At the moment, that pyramid is the opposite of the kind of thing that we learnt at school. What about Turkey? Well, yours is, of course, has elements of perhaps a number of the ones that we've been looking at. You haven't, compared with some countries like Italy, got quite so many yet in the upper age brackets when we look at the population. But we'll be seeing changes in Turkey, and we're going to be seeing those changes following on from some of the changes we're seeing already about population change. We've got 36 countries around the world are already experiencing falls in their populations. South Korea, for example, already adapting to schools, universities closing, and even hospitals are having to reduce the sizes of their maternity and gynecological facilities. Let's look at Turkey back in 1950 and think about the changes that you're experiencing, to think about the whole span of a century. That is a classic population pyramid, of course, with relatively few at the top, relatively large numbers at the bottom. You're going towards something rather different in 2050, where the median age is 41, where the average age is 84, and you will have many more people in those older age groups, by the way, with significant spending power, of course, but also with certain needs, particularly in the areas of healthcare as they enter later life. So if you're looking for some references on Turkey, it may not be the obvious comparison point, but you might look at France today, because they have a very similar population pyramid to the one that you are moving towards. Clearly some margins of error, which is why we've shaded some green in there, but we do feel we all need to be very open and clear about the dynamics of populations and population change in individual countries. Technology and tech acceleration is our second focus. I mentioned that the internet has been with us for 10 years, but of course, big changes, big acceleration, including this year. We've all had to learn, if we weren't experts, about generative AI, which perhaps wasn't something that we talked about much even this time last year in conferences like this. So what are the points that we might draw there, thinking about the public and thinking how they're reacting to these changes? I think the first thing is it's hard to summarize. Some people are finding it very alarming about how our data is going to be used. Others are finding it more acceptable, particularly provided there's a good contract between us in terms of what I give you and how you are going to be using your information, my information, to support my service, the services that you give me. When I talk about generative AI, by the way, the big theme that we're getting in absolute parallel is a mixture of wonder and worry, of excitement and scaredness about what it all may bring. So certainly a number of different dynamics just to be aware of. Very hard, I would say, to generalize. But one thing to be clear about is that people are now starting to be more open than they were. If you look at the green versus the orange, that's 10 years ago, the orange, the green is now. I fear that technological progress or technical progress is destroying our lives. That is very much more present than it was 10 years ago. In Turkey, for example, 67% fear that technological progress is destroying our lives, even if many of us can't imagine life without the internet. So we do have elements of concern, alarm, fear in there when we're starting to talk about technological change. And talking about fear and alarm, we of course need to reflect on the environmental emergencies, which are one of the macro forces that we reflect on in our report. This is one where we do have a consensus around the world about the need for change. We're heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly. It's almost like a value almost that seems to unite the world. These questions don't vary much over time in recent years. They don't vary that much between countries. And certainly already we're finding 6 in 10 people around the world are telling us that they're already witnessing the impact of climate change in their country. So we have some consensus at that level. But once we start to look at it in the context of other aspects of our lives, of other priorities, things get a little bit more complicated. We're finding already that there is less of a sense of urgency for governments or for businesses or for people to act now, today. It's very important, but perhaps we need to just pace ourselves because we have so many economic problems in front of us. And perhaps we see that in a study that we do every month called What Worries the World? Because there we ask people to tell us what their big worries are facing their country in the context of a whole series of worries. So for many months we had coronavirus top, that's fallen down. It's been replaced by inflation, but climate change tends not to be in the top 5. And similarly, if we look at it by country, Turkey is not one of the countries most worried about climate change, but we're rarely getting any countries over 25 to 30% at the moment. So certainly when we ask people to think about what's worrying them about their lives in their country, climate change is alongside the other topics in their lives, and the hierarchy of needs comes into play. Perhaps there's a researcher point of view, and as marketeers, you're often using research data. It's a reminder for us always to be clear about what questions we're asking and what's the context that we are posing those questions. So a big marker there about climate change. What else should we be thinking about? Well, one of the topics that we often talk about in our own work when we reflect particularly on the international research that we do across countries is this element of what's global, what's local, how can you generalize globally, where can you not generalize globally at all. And so my final section really is perhaps to reflect on some questions where we're deliberately putting all of the countries together and showing you the span of attitudes that people have around the world. And one of the topics that often really does interest marketeers, so we thought it might be interesting for you today, is the topic of nostalgia, a sense that I would like my country to be the way it used to be. They may not like it in reality if you reminded them of how their country was, but this sense perhaps of some kind of golden age or a better time that we've now lost is often evident in individual countries. And Turkey, if anything, is more at the top end of the spectrum there in having a nostalgic tinge when we look at these questions. Similarly, on global versus local, a different way to look at it. I'm more of a citizen of the world. People in Turkey are more likely than in some other countries to disagree on that point. Similarly, on globalization is good for my country. On balance, people in Turkey are saying it is, but perhaps a little bit less than in some of the other countries on the left-hand side of the chart. But what that doesn't necessarily mean is that the people in Turkey are really, really strongly oriented to buy the products of my own country rather than buying products from abroad. So we need to be very careful at just taking some readings on public opinion data like that. We need to look at a broader basket of indicators. This one suggests rather more nuanced a sense of let's say where people's minds are, and it's a reminder of how we must always think about the particular country that we're working in or trying to understand better, the particular context of where it's gone and where it's heading, but also the individual categories, because that 45%, for example, in Turkey will vary depending on the category, and it may vary very significantly, and it may also vary over time, particularly in times of economic crisis. And so that's, I think, an interesting marker when we perhaps just try to think about what opinion data like this means. And I hope this report helps ask questions, but it certainly doesn't tell you exactly what to do. But we hope it gives you that context to help you make better informed decisions. And on that point, bearing in mind your roles, bearing in mind what you're trying to do about your brands and your organizations, and to be more sustainable in all senses of the word. This is a question that we often find can raise some good discussions when we have debates in the conference room and outside. I trust business leaders to tell the truth. And you'll notice a big variation by country, a bigger variation than in some of the other questions that I was sharing with you. And you'll notice that trust in Turkey is among the lowest that we recorded in our study. So I guess one of the questions is for your own organizations and for your own brands is to, of course, reflect on that finding, but perhaps think about how your organization, your brands and your work can perhaps let's say stand out and perhaps be more genuine or be closer or be more giving or be more relevant or be more in tune with people's lives. So the climate that we found in this study raised some questions perhaps about people's instincts, and Turkey being one of those countries which is inclined to be less trusting of its business leaders. So I leave that thought with you, and I hope it might spark some discussion in the remainder of our sessions together. In terms of final thoughts, well, I think the big things that we would suggest is there certainly are some common ground that we can find in what is a complex world, and we've reflected on some of that today, a sense perhaps of some nostalgia, a sense that the environment is genuinely in a state of emergency, even if it's not entirely clear whether we need to address it quite as quickly as we might have been saying last year, but also common ground on technology. It's absolutely at the heart of our lives. Of course, we can see the benefits, but there's certainly common ground about the worries and uncertainty, unease perhaps on that topic. So common ground, good and bad. I hope I've underlined enough of the importance to always remember the local dimensions. During the COVID crisis, we always found very quickly that although it was a global crisis, the reactions to what was happening differed so much on the ground, and we, those of us working on international work, had to really be careful about using global averages, for example, or even just global descriptions of what's happening. And then coming back to our opening points about the polycrisis, this new word in the English language, this multifaceted dynamic, well, it does suggest that the solutions might be multifaceted around, and perhaps the challenges around climate change, for example, do raise very real and often worrying questions about whether brands, governments and individuals can work together to address them. We know that that's what people would want to see. We know that that's what brands, I think, would want to see if they could speak. And we know that that's what governments would want to see. But can we get the right people working together? Can we get solutions that are going to work for today and tomorrow? The question of poly solutions is very much coming to the fore. So that really ends my quick tour. As I mentioned, 50 countries, lots more information in there. I just tried to give you some highlights, but I hope it's been useful for you both, building on the discussions that you've been having. I know you're thinking about change from different angles, and I hope it's been a useful piece, let's say, of reflection for you as you look at where you go next. So thank you very much for having me. Back to you, Vincent.